WFLA Now will begin momentarily. WFLA Now will begin momentarily. Live on WFLA Now, this is Hey JV. Here's JV Biunno.
A shocking breakthrough
is the one that did it. It's rough. It's hard to say. It's hard to even put the words out right now.
A shocking breakthrough in the 1983 murder of an 11-year-old in Florida, as the evidence points to a deputy within their own office, a deceased deputy, the only probable suspect 4 decades after the heinous crime. Hey there, folks. JV Biunno here with you live on WFLA Now. We're just learning more about this story in the last hour. We're talking about the cold case murder of 11-year-old Lora Ann in St. Lucie County. Now, the only probable suspect in this case is former St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office Deputy James Howard Harrison on the right side of your screen. And we're also learning that Harrison might be connected to sexual assault cases across the state of Florida. He worked for 10 Florida law enforcement agencies, including right here in the Tampa Bay area as well. Now, it was back on November 6th, 1983, nearly 40 years ago in St. Lucie County, when the sexual assault and murder of Lora Ann Huizar occurred. Lora Ann Huizar, the victim you see here in the center of your screen. Original reports said that there was an ununiformed patrol deputy, later confirmed to be Harrison, who saw Huizar walking toward her home around the time of her disappearance. And then it was 3 days later that Huizar's body was found nearby. Deputies said that both locations were within Harrison's assigned patrol zone, and that Harrison was unable to be linked to the case due to really no viable evidence at the time. Now, years later, more evidence would be gathered and a cold case investigation would be conducted by the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office, and they just held a presser a short time ago, including with Sheriff Ken Mascara, who said that he used to work with Harrison back in the 70s. So you're about to hear from the sheriff of St. Lucie County, who worked with former Deputy James Howard Harrison, who passed away in 2008. An important detail, considering charges can't be filed in this case. Harrison has been deceased now for about 14 or so years. He passed away of cancer, as we understand it. So we want you to take a listen. This is a shocking result, and you can hear it in the voices of the sheriff himself and the deputies you're about to hear from as they learned more and more about the homicide of Lora Ann. It was just startling, all the evidence that pointed them right in the direction of their own sheriff's office.
As this case progressed, there are some other turns to this case that really has shocked us all to our core, that being the arrest of a former deputy as the probable, not the arrest, but the identification of a former deputy as the probable suspect in this murder. Another twist to this case, this former deputy, James Harrison, I worked with in the late 70s and early 80s. He actually was a zone partner of mine when I was on the road. And I want to guess it was somewhere around 79 or 80, I had made a complaint to my supervisors that I thought this deputy relationships with young adults. Not sexual, not anything like that, but his interactions with young adults I thought was inappropriate. My concerns went up the food chain here at the sheriff's office at the time, and my supervisor told me because he was a preacher that he was spiritually mentoring children at risk and teenagers at risk. As I look back, and Detective Taylor is going to expand on this, in my mind I wonder if he was using his authority as a deputy sheriff and his standing as a preacher in the community to go ahead and violate children during the entire course of his life. This is a very, very concerning case because of that, but I can tell you that Detective Taylor will delve more into the facts of how he put the pieces together to make him the probable suspect in this homicide. And without further ado, we're going to have Chief Deputy Hester go over some facts, and then Paul Taylor can really delve into the facts that led us to today. So, Chief Deputy Hester.
Well, good morning, everybody. And as the sheriff said, I'm going to really just cover some of the facts of the case and maybe try to alleviate a few questions that you might have, and then we'll open up to Detective Taylor and the sheriff and myself to answer any questions you might have. So I apologize, but the facts are rather lengthy, so I'm going to have to read some of these. So just bear with me as we go through them. But, you know, the headline is that we solved a 1983 cold case homicide involving Lora Ann Huizar. So based on the information that was obtained during this investigation of the cold case, detectives have named former Deputy James Howard Harrison as the only probable suspect in the case. All right, and just pay attention to how I worded that, the only probable suspect in this case. The sheriff's office is unable to pursue charges against Mr. Harrison due to his death in 2008. We have established probable cause. As you know, probable cause is what we need to make an arrest. But we have established probable cause to determine that Harrison abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered the juvenile victim, and later altered the crime scene by placing the victim in a drainage ditch in an attempt to destroy physical evidence. Some more facts about the case in 1983. On November 6, 1983, according to original witness reports, a uniformed patrol deputy, later confirmed to be Harrison, observed Huizar walking toward her home from a local gas station around the same time as her disappearance. On November 9th of 1983, 3 days later, deputies recovered Huizar's body nearby that location where Harrison saw her. Both locations were within Harrison's zone or district that he patrolled. They were near Midway Road and Shin Road in western St. Lucie County. Detectives that were originally assigned to this case back in 1983 were unable to link Harrison to the crime or identify any viable suspects at that time. In 2021, analysis at a private DNA lab recovered unknown male DNA from the victim's sexual assault kit that was done back in 1983. In response to this new evidence, cold case detectives obtained a search warrant to exhume Harrison's body. However, a comparison was not possible due to the fact that Harrison's DNA had degraded so much over the past 30 some odd years. As detectives continued to investigate, those familiar with the original investigation have confirmed that Harrison had instructed 2 witnesses back on that date when the body was found to leave the scene approximately 20 minutes before additional law enforcement personnel arrived to assist in the investigation. Cold case detectives also learned that the location and position of the victim's body, once the initial crime scene investigators arrived on scene, differed from that of witness statements. Harrison had worked for 10 separate law enforcement agencies in Florida since 1960s. During this time, he exhibited a pattern of inappropriate behavior involving juvenile females. This pattern has led detectives to believe that Harrison may be responsible for other sexual assault cases across our state. So we're asking the community, if you have any information, we're asking really the state of Florida, if you have any information regarding James Harrison or his possible involvement in any other criminal investigation, you may contact the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office Criminal Investigation Division at 772-462-3230. So that concludes the facts of what we have today. The one thing I want to follow up before we take questions with is, I know you're going to ask, you know, why is this important? Why are we going back and we're looking at these cold cases? And I'll give you two answers. One is closure to the families, closure to the families of the victims of these cold cases, and to provide, if you were a family member and you had lost a loved one in a violent crime and you didn't know who or how or a suspect, there's a piece of closure there that doesn't exist. And so our goal is to try and reopen as many of these cold cases and do our best to solve them. And you say, well, why now? Well, because technology has changed so drastically in law enforcement over 20, 30, 40 years. And so technology affords us the ability to do what we're doing. So we're using that technology, we're using new training, we're using detectives that have great experience to go back and look at these cases, just like this one of Lora Ann Huizar, and to attempt to provide that closure and to solve some of these cases for our community. So with that, I'm going to open it up to questions. We've got Detective Taylor. Did we want him to speak? Do you have anything you want, or just answer questions?
I'll just answer questions.
Okay, just answer questions. So with that, we'll take questions.
So my math is right. She would have been in her like 50s today. Does she still have family in the area? And have you guys so been able to contact them?
And he has spoke with the family. So.
And what was their reaction?
Hello. Yes, I did go meet with the family. Once I closed the case, me and my supervisor drove over and met with the family, sat down with them. Some of them were from out of state. They actually flew in to meet with us over on the West Coast. So we sat with them for several hours going over the case. They were distraught, to say the least. The first thing they told me was, we're glad it wasn't somebody that we actually knew, that it wasn't a family member or anywhere along those lines. So,
Sheriff, you said that you had complained, you sent your complaint up to your superiors.
Correct.
Do you know how many complaints were made about him during his time here? Was he terminated as a result, or what brought his career here to an end?
Well, I worked with him in the late 70s, early 80s, and he worked here until I left the agency September of 1980. He was still here. He left in 82, unbeknownst to me. I don't know what the reason was, but came back in 83, so he's only gone for a short period of time. I returned to St. Lucie County the end of 83 and actually became a reserve member on the Sheriff's Office, and he was working here. And it was shortly after my return here that he resigned under, what's the word I want to use? He resigned after some accusations were made. I do not know the extent of those accusations, but I knew that he resigned then, and that was in 1984.
Earlier, I guess Chief Deputy Hester was talking about Harrison had a number of complaints or issues in his 10 prior law enforcement agencies. Why was he hired then if he had such a sort of checkered past or whatever?
Yeah, he can.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Please do.
okay, so whenever I first started this investigation has taken almost 2 years to do. Whenever I first started looking into this case, Deputy Harrison was not a suspect. The only thing that I saw glaring in there that really made me scratch my head was if this little girl, she's very small, she was carrying a bundle of clothing, and she's seen by a uniformed patrol deputy within view of her driveway. And what made me scratch my head was any deputy that saw this little girl walking in the area that she was walking would assume that she was a runaway. She's carrying clothes, she's little, they would have stopped out with her. So at that point in time, it was like, why did this deputy not stop out with her and give her a ride home? If that would have happened and everything would have went perfectly, right now she would probably be married and have children and all of that. So talking to the old people that used to, or the old timers from here, basically the way they hired and fired people back in those days was all based off of your resume. Talking to our old assistant chief, he said, Paul, he said, back then, he said, these guys would come in to get a job, and he said, it wasn't like you could get on the internet and do a background search, or there wasn't no master phone log of every law enforcement agency in Florida. He said, people would come in and say, hey, here's my resume, I've got experience in law enforcement. They would review that, and they're pretty much hired off of that. So that's kind of how this whole thing, that's how he kind of slipped through the cracks through all of these 11 different agencies that he worked, 10 different agencies that he worked at.
So when did Deputy Harrison sort of become a suspect, I guess?
So during my investigation, basically what I do is I kind of start at the beginning and I treat the investigation like it happened the day before. I started trying to find any witnesses that were available. I started going through everything that's in the case file. I got to a point where I went and I interviewed the original witnesses that found her. At that point in time, Harrison was not even a name in my radar. So when I started talking to them, I asked them if they could describe what they saw that day, because there's nothing in the report from them about what they found, what they saw. Detectives never made contact with them again. After that initial point, when they found her and Jim Harrison showed up, he sent them from the scene, and they were never contacted by law enforcement again. So the description that they were giving me, and I asked them, I said, it's been almost 40 years. Do you remember this case? And there was tears. They started crying and said, I see that little girl lying there every time I close my eyes for the last 38 years. And I said, okay. I said, can you explain to me what you saw? And it was very graphic. It was very vivid. They had a very good recollection of everything that they saw on the scene that day. So the description that I'm getting from them, I had already looked at all of the crime scene photos. I'd been through most of the case file, and what they're telling me does not match what I'm seeing. So at that point in time, I'm like, what's wrong with this picture? So I started digging a little more. I came back. I started going through the crime scene photos, and then I started reaching out to every single person that I could that would have been around at our agency back then. And that's when I started learning there was some inappropriate things, there was some accusations, and that's when I started looking into him.
So you started looking into, are we talking like last year, or a year and a half, 2 years?
I've probably been looking at him for over a year. I can't tell you the exact date that it's like, ooh, Jim Harrison might be a possible suspect, but I have reached out to a lot of people that knew him. I reached out to every different agency that he's worked at. I got a lot of information from years past from his law enforcement career.
Are there any other cold cases in any other parts of Florida that kind of match up with this case around that same time that could possibly be linked to Harrison?
Yes, so I actually went and I met with the Florida Sheriff's Association. They have a cold case advisory commission. I was there yesterday to give them a briefing on this case because I submitted this case to them back in the beginning of 2001, and they have spent a lot of money on this case. They paid for all of our DNA testing. They did a lot of things. They gave me advice on different avenues to go. Talking to them yesterday, with the 10 agencies that he worked at, they're all right up the middle of the state. And I've reached out to all of them. They are looking through their files now. I've actually, since this got released this morning, my phone has been ringing like crazy in my office. I've had other agencies calling me saying, hey, we've got these unsolved rapes, could it be him? His DNA is in CODIS now. I put them in contact with FDLE to get his DNA profile to see if he matches any of these other cases. The Cold Case Commission also wants me to do a press release to them that they can send out to every law enforcement agency across Florida to see if this does match any other cases that they might have.
If his DNA is in the system, can you not compare it to the sample from the
So
rape kit?
the sample, we did, whenever I exhumed him, we did get a profile from him. The FDLE said that as soon as we can get a profile, send it to them. The profile that what we couldn't do with that profile is we couldn't compare it to the DNA that was recovered from her rape kit. The DNA in the rape kit was showing that it was a male DNA profile, but it was too degraded to be able to compare to Harrison's DNA that I obtained.
Oh,
So yeah, they just could not get it, you know, and hopefully, you know, years from now when DNA advances, because it advances every 6 months, so hopefully down the road that's something that they can compare it to, but they were just unable to make a comparison to the rape kit.
In hindsight, do you think the sheriff's office back then made mistakes? Was this deputy at all involved in the investigation? Was he able to kind of keep a strong hold over information that might come forward? In hindsight, do you think there were missteps?
There was missteps. There's no doubt about that. And the good thing is whenever I talked to the family, I told them, you know, we've learned a lot over the years. We don't do a homicide investigation in 2022 like they did in 1983. There was a lot of steps that are missed. Whenever I was talking to the old chief deputy, he was saying, Paul, this is how it is. You know, this is how these investigations used to work. The original detective on that case, he's still alive and he still lives in St. Lucie County. I actually brought him in, and for 3 hours we went through the case file. He was reviewing everything. He was giving me his opinions. He was, you know, pretty much telling me what happened with that case. And basically that case, when she went missing, it was on a Sunday, November 6, 1983. She went missing after staying the night with her friend. When she went missing that night, when the dad was trying to find her to bring her home, they couldn't find her. So when they called 911 and the deputy came out, when the deputy took the original missing person report, talking to the detective said, Paul, back then, we didn't do much. He said back then, we always assumed that if a juvenile was missing, they're over at their friend's house, or they're hanging out here, or they got busy doing something else, and they're going to return home. And he said that's how that case was. He said 3 days later when she was found, he said the sheriff was mad. He said the sheriff said, I want an arrest made right now. He said that they went out and they were stopping every single car, truck, you know, fruit trailer, anything that was going up and down Okeechobee Road trying to find a suspect. And all of the suspects that they came up with back then, they were all ruled out.
And was Deputy Harrison involved in the investigation itself?
He was not. He was actually brought in, and I have no documentation of this except for the word of other employees that were employed here back then. They said that he was brought in, and they asked him, you know, when you saw this little girl, what was going on with her? So that kind of adds to how this whole thing could have happened, because I actually took crime scene out to the scene there and took pictures of everything. And I'm standing at the intersection where she was last seen. And if you look to the east, you can see where she came from. You can see the business that she had just walked from. And if you look to the south, you can see her mailbox. So there is it's a very, very small window of opportunity for her to go missing and for him to make contact with her right in the middle of that, within view of where she came from and where she was going. There's really not much time left for anybody to just come in and snatch her up. And with her being where she was found, where her body was discovered, was approximately 600 yards to the southeast of where she was abducted from. So that also goes to show you that they really didn't do a good search, because I mean she's right there. And the family said they went out on bikes and rode all around and didn't find her. So there was a lot of things missed in that investigation, and they never doubled back to speak with the original witnesses. And that was confirmed through the witnesses. That was confirmed from the original detective. He said, Paul, we missed it. He said if we would have went back, once I started telling him about what I had found, he said if we would have went back that day and met with them and had them write out a statement and tell us, we would have known she wasn't in the water. We would have known she was laying in the grass, face up and not face down in the water like she was found. So.
How did the deputy die? Do you know?
I believe he died of cancer. I was able to find that out just by Google searches and familytreenow.com, which is my favorite website. But
Why do you think this rape kit wasn't retested in 2020 or 2019 when technology was still pretty advanced?
well, at that point in time, before I started working the cold cases full time, back then the way it worked in the detective bureau is, I mean, our detective bureau is very busy. And the way it always worked was if it slowed down enough to have any free time, the supervisors would tell the detectives, hey, grab one of those cold cases, start going through it. Well, you would start going through it, you're maybe going through it for 1 or 2 days, and then it's like, oh, we got a homicide, or we got this, put it back on the shelf, let's go, and that's just the way it was.
Do you have a list of the 10 agencies on hand?
I do.
Do you think that there was any like conspiracy going on? I mean, because when you say like when it was disclosed that I guess Deputy Harrison told these 2 witnesses to leave prior to other deputies getting there, I mean, do you think that there was some sort of a conspiracy, like others could have been involved? Or
I did look into that. I've questioned every single person that I can find that was involved with the agency back then. Harrison was not a real well-liked guy anyway, but whenever I talked to the original detective, I'm saying, dude, how could this happen? And he said, Paul, he said, he was a cop. He was another deputy. When we got there, he said, hey, they found this girl, brought me to her, and they left. And that was it. I mean, that's the statement that we got. But he said that back then, this is a deputy telling them this. You know, a deputy just said, hey, this is everything that they told me. They driving through the grove, they found her, and I sent them home. So at that point in time, like I said earlier, the sheriff was like, I want an arrest made now. It was all hands on deck, scramble to solve that case. And it was just, it's something that was overlooked where they didn't make it back to interviewing the original witnesses.
why would he keep their contact information if he, you know what I mean? If he was intentionally trying to get people to deflect people from talking to these original witnesses that could have perhaps.
And that could be the reason why he didn't, you know, why he never went back and talked to them. The detectives, though, they just had their hands full. They were busy. They were trying to come up with something.
This is major because oftentimes cold cases don't get solved. A lot of these cases end with heartache, heartbreak, and mystery, but this case was solved. Can you speak more about the percentages of cold cases that actually get solved around the country and why this is so major for this, you know, law enforcement agency as well as the family of the victim?
Well, the statistics that I've been able to find is that only 2% of cold cases, approximately 2% of cold cases in the United States are actually solved. Looking into, as far as law enforcement agencies that have a full-time cold case unit, there's only 7% of law enforcement agencies across the country that have a full-time cold case unit, where there's somebody that works those cases all the time. And that's kind of what it takes to get to these, you know, because looking at it for 2 days and putting it back on the shelf doesn't work.
What was the moment like for you when you were able to tell the family that this is the most probable suspect? You described, you know, what they said. So what was that moment like for you when you were able to give them that information?
I will tell you, I've been in law enforcement 30 years. Like I told them, and I know it went into the email, that day was my best day in law enforcement. And it was also my worst day. It's still my worst day because I am actually standing there in front of this victim's family and I'm telling them that one of our deputies is the one that did it. It's rough. It's hard to say. It's hard to even put the words out right now. I wish it would have been somebody else. I wish it would have been some, you know, dirtbag that does this all the time. But I mean, I had to follow the evidence, and the evidence led to him, unfortunately. So,
if he was still alive now, would you have enough to file a warrant?
I absolutely would, and I would love for him to be alive right now because in my 30 years of law enforcement, there is nobody else I would rather have in the box interviewing than him.
Where was he buried, I guess?
He was buried in Ocoee, which is on the other side of Orlando.
Do we have a name of the church he was a pastor of, and is that church still very much thriving? And
I do. Whenever he was forced to resign from our agency, this was 5 months after the homicide, He was forced to resign from our agency. He also was forced to resign from that church. The church, it's changed hands quite a few times, and I'm sure they don't know a lot about what's going on, but I don't know if can we release the name of the church?
It's no longer, the church is there, but it's a different organization.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's Bethel Baptist Church in Fort Pierce.
And was he an actual, like, legit ordained
He was a
minister?
pastor, yes, he was. And everybody that knew him called him preacher.
Correct.
Every agency that I've reached out to said, oh, preacher, yeah. Everybody knew him as preacher.
I mean, this case was so close to you. I believe we talked to you recently. You had a picture of her hanging in your office.
It's still there right now. I have, so, I mean, I can tell you the story of how that picture came to be, but there is a picture of her in my office.
Go ahead, I think it's important.
So, okay, so that picture hangs above my desk every day. So basically, I lost my only child to suicide 5 years ago. There had been a while after he died that I had no dreams of him, and it used to bother me, and it upset my wife that she wasn't having dreams of him. So one night I had a dream of my son, and I heard him, and he always called me Pappy. And I heard him, I'm walking somewhere, and I hear him yelling my name. And I'm looking around, I don't see him, and finally I see him coming up to me, and he's screaming at me, and he's like, Pappy, I found her. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And he gets right in my face, and he says, I found her. And I'm like, who are you talking about? And I looked over, and I saw Lora standing there. And she just looked at me and said one word to me, or one sentence to me, and she said, keep digging. And I woke up. So the picture, when I got into my office the next day, I pulled a picture of her out. She's standing in front of this little wall. She's just a little bitty girl. And I wrote on it, keep digging, Lora Ann, and stuck it on my wall, and it's been there ever since.
Back in the 80s, were any arrests ever initially made? Anybody initially charged?
No, they were unable to develop good suspect information on anybody. At that point in time, all of the detectives that were working that case, they all just assumed that it was a traveler, somebody driving between Fort Pierce and Okeechobee. Whenever I first started working the case, I'm trying to make sense of that because in my feeble mind, I just couldn't understand if somebody drove up and snatched her and they were just traveling back and forth, they would have grabbed her and left the area. They wouldn't have stayed right there in this area. I mean, it's out in the middle of nowhere. They would have hauled her away, and for her to be found 600 yards to the south or to the southeast, it wasn't a traveler.
And then if this type of situation happened today where a deputy said, oh, I spoke with the witnesses, they said she was found over there, what would happen next today?
There'd be detectives going there. We would get them on tape. We got body cams. I love my body cam. It's like a portable interview room. We would go talk to them, get a statement from them, written statement, recorded statement, have them come here. We would get all that information from them. I mean, we would try to gather as much information as we could, every little detail. I mean, there's a lot of things that I would have asked them back then. You know, how long has it been since you've been in the Grove? Why were you in the Grove? You know, how long had it been since you had been in the Grove? You know, lots of different things. Who all works in the Grove? I mean, there's a million different questions that a detective nowadays would ask them. It didn't happen back then.
I apologize.
That's all right.
It sounds like just the profession, law enforcement in general, over the years has gotten far more meticulous, thorough, sort of deep diving, I guess, not just sort of, oh, well, Deputy Joe Blow talked to this witness, I don't need to talk to them. I mean, much more thorough. And this type of thing perhaps would be far less likely to happen now than perhaps
Well,
back then.
I will tell you this. I work with some of the best detectives in the world. We are very good at our jobs. If a homicide comes up, we are very, very good at solving homicides. We're very thorough. We go through, I mean, our supervisors were all detectives. They were great detectives in their day. Now they're supervising us and telling us, hey, do this, this, and this. And it works very, very well. We have a great detective bureau.
Live on WFLA Now, this is Hey JB. Here's JB Biunno.
That was the press conference from the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office. JB here, back with you on WFLA Now. Wanted to play that back in its entirety just because it's chock full of really pertinent information to a case that we can spend 20, 30 minutes hearing from the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office when you think about just how much time has elapsed between Lora Huizar being sexually assaulted and murdered in St. Lucie County to us learning today what in fact happened to her nearly 40 years ago. So taking 20, 30 minutes to hear from investigators on a case that has been really 4 decades in the making, that's the very least that we can do is just hear a little bit more on the backstory as to how they came to the conclusion that it was one of their own. Deputy James Howard Harrison, a former, or excuse me, a deceased deputy, I should say rather, a deputy that has worked in 10 law enforcement agencies across the state of Florida, including here in the Tampa Bay area. We have, of course, calls into the Hernando County Sheriff's Office, Brooksville PD, 2 agencies that Harrison is said to have worked for. Now, they called him preacher. When you heard there from Detective Paul Taylor that in their interviews digging into this case, everyone referred to him as preacher, talking about Deputy Harrison here. It cannot be understated that Deputy Harrison was a trusted member of multiple communities across Florida because of his stints in law enforcement in different Florida communities. And I want to read some more about the case for those who maybe caught the tail end of the press conference. Deputies say that they were able to establish probable cause in this case, learning that Harrison would later alter the crime scene of Lora Huizar's, of the scene of her homicide by placing Huizar in a drainage ditch in an attempt to destroy physical evidence. The quote here from Detective Taylor: "The day I solved this case was both the worst and best day of my 30-year career in law enforcement. Nobody dislikes a bad cop more than a good cop, and it felt bittersweet to finally provide the victim's family with some long-awaited answers," end quote. And you heard the sheriff's office say that when they went to the family members that remain of Lora Huizar, that they were distraught learning of the news. And really, 40 years after the fact, how could you not be distraught to finally understand what happened to an 11-year-old girl? The Deputy Harrison worked for a lot of different law enforcement organizations across the state of Florida, including at the Hernando County Sheriff's Office, going back to the 60s. I mean, it really goes to show. I mean, this is a case that goes way back in time. Deputies said that Harrison had exhibited a pattern of inappropriate behavior involving juvenile females. And again, being a combination deputy and pastor, and known around town as preacher, just really goes to show that there was so much trust put in Deputy Harrison, but according to the sheriff's office, that trust betrayed, and perhaps betrayed more than we really fully understand. In the press release and in the press conference you just heard, you heard that there is likely a pattern of there is a pattern of inappropriate behavior across his multiple stints in law enforcement, and that there might be other victims out there. So we're doing digging now, of course, talking to folks with the Hernando County Sheriff's Office, Brooksville PD. We're trying to, of course, do our homework here in the Tampa Bay area, but there are other cases out there that remain unsolved. And is there a chance that Deputy Harrison is connected to other cases that are yet to be fully realized here in the state of Florida? It's too early to say, but this opens up a can of worms, so to speak, into the history of somebody who really spent the entirety of his career in law enforcement and as a trusted member of the religious community across several Florida communities here in the Sunshine State. So really just a shocking result to this story 40 years after the fact. And now real digging continues here as to where Deputy Harrison worked, where he was trusted to work in both law enforcement and with young females, perhaps in connection to various churches here on the peninsula. It's of course going to be something that we're digging into here at WFLA. But the fact of the matter is, Deputy Harrison passed away in 2008. You heard them say that they believe it to be of cancer. That's 14 years ago. So 14 years too late as far as being able to charge Harrison, Deputy Harrison, in connection to this case or any others that he might be found to be in connection with. So that is, of course, the most difficult part of this to swallow, is that you just do not have justice in this case. You do not have charges being filed against what they describe as the lone suspect in the murder of 11-year-old Florida girl Lora Ann Huizar, here in the center of your screen. Folks, that's going to wrap it up here for us on WFLA Now. I see we've got a lot of other big stories to get to here. I would stay here with you live and try to answer some questions, but other big stories developing here today. Very busy day in the Tampa Bay area. Busy day, a lot of news coming in. All the latest right now is on WFLA.com and the WFLA app, including on this story. If you want to click and read more yourself about this story, again, a shocking story, a cold case, really coming full circle and leading detectives today in 2022 back to their own office. If you want to read more about that story, this story, the one that we're talking about, just click on the link in the description of this video. It'll take you over to WFLA.com and the WFLA app. More ahead in the hours ahead on WFLA.com and here live on WFLA Now.